Well, thank you all for being here with us this morning. Really appreciate you joining us, and I hope this will be a helpful time for you all, and it'll certainly be helpful to us, especially to learn from you all about what you're doing and what God's called you to do, and hear about your various contexts and your thoughts about how some of what we'll talk about this morning might apply really well to your context, or might apply differently, or might not apply at all. So we understand there are people from all over and all different types of work and different types of organizations. So looking forward to hearing your feedback. So this morning's session is Not All Givers Are Alike and Why That Matters. And that'll be the first part of what we talk about. We're going to talk about different types of people that we've encountered over the years in fundraising, different types of donors, financial partners, whatever you want to call them. People are at different places in their maturity in giving, in how they give and why they give, and it's really important that as we are out there raising money, that we understand some of those differences. So the list that we have is not a completely final list. It doesn't encapsulate every point, but there are some common characteristics, I think, in the four categories of givers that we'll discuss. And again, as I said, I think it just is absolutely critical that we tailor our fundraising efforts, our strategies, our tactics to the people we are talking to. We will also talk about how to ask for a gift. I've been full-time fundraising essentially for almost 10 years now. And one of the first things that people say when I tell them that I'm a fundraiser is they say, I could never do that. I could never ask anyone for money. That's a very common response that I hear. And it is a scary thing. It's an intimidating thing. Hopefully after today's sessions, it'll be a little less intimidating for you, and just understanding some concepts and ideas about how you might do that better than you already do. We will be practicing, so get ready, gear up for session 2 when we are going to ask you to be practicing what an ask looks like, and hopefully seeing that and practicing that will make us just a little bit better than we were before.
I am Mark Dillon. I'll tell you just a little bit about my background. I'm a graduate of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield. And through circumstances, when I graduated, though we had a call to a church, we stayed on at Trinity, worked in student development for just a couple of years, and then was asked to learn about fundraising and help the school in their fundraising, which I did for almost 10 years. And then was contacted by Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and went there to lead their fundraising team, which I did for 19 years. So I was there a good long time and learned a lot about what it means to interact with God's people and what it means to ask in hopefully an effective way and God-honoring way. And for the last 4 years, I've been consulting full-time, working with Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, ministries of all sizes throughout the country. It's really a thrill to hear about the cool ministries that are happening throughout Europe, and I commend the work that you're doing, and am deeply in prayer that what we have to share will help you be just a little bit more effective in the fundraising realm. And as we always say, in this world, money fuels ministry. If we had more resources, you could do more in terms of the kingdom. So all this is about how can we help God's people release more funds for kingdom eternal purposes. That's what we want to share with you. Well, we talked about George Mueller, and I think a lot of people love his approach. One, because it certainly is a biblical approach of total dependence upon God. It also leaves us off the hook of having conversations one-on-one with individuals, right? Let me tell you about someone on the other side of the ocean in about the same era. You've all heard of Moody. He had a little bit different approach to it. He came out of the business world. He was a shoe salesman, if I remember correctly. And his approach to all the education and social services projects that he was involved in was much more of an entrepreneurial approach. What's the problem that we need to address? How are we going to address that problem? How much money do we need to address that problem? And then he would invite people to invest in that so that they could make this happen. And in his ministry, and it wasn't just located in the Chicago area, his reach was all the way to the East Coast from Chicago. But again, God blessed his ministry as he challenged God's people to invest in God's work. So while Mueller was on the other side of the ocean praying and seeing God's provision, I'm sure D.L. Moody had plenty of prayer too, but he also thought it was part of his responsibility to challenge God's people. I want to tell you about a third person that I learned about in my years at Wheaton. Charles Blanchard, again, was roughly in the same time period as George Mueller and D.L. Moody. He was the second president of Wheaton College. And Wheaton was far from well-established when he was president. He was there for 42 years. And he considered it his responsibility to challenge God's people to give. And if you went into the archives of Wheaton today, somebody shared with me that they were on our campus just in the last few months. If you went to the archives at Wheaton, you would find a stack of 10 or 12 leather-bound journals, and they were Charles Blanchard's journals. And he would keep meticulous records of his trips. He would get on the train or the carriage and go into the city of Chicago, about 25 miles away. And he would meet with Christian businessmen. He met with some of the famous philanthropists of his day, names like Wanamaker and Pullman and Field. And he would keep very meticulous notes, met with him on this particular day. Now, I'm not sure what the result of some of those philanthropic giants were, but there were many where he would go to a business office and he'd write down, committed $100 by June, or said, this has been a bad year, can't give anything. Now, here's the interesting thing. He was very intentional about asking for gifts. He was very intentional about keeping records and following up. And yet, if you look in the front page of each one of those journals, you're going to find the passage from Philippians 4, "My God will supply all your needs according to his riches in Christ Jesus." And that, to me, epitomizes, I think, what our fundraising task is today. We need to plan, we need to work, we need to ask, and yet at the end of the day, it doesn't much matter what we've done or even what the donor has done, but it's what God has done in our lives and the donor's life to bring that gift about. So you've probably already sensed that our approach is we need to be as excellent and as professional as we know how to be, and yet at the end of the day, totally dependent upon the Lord's provision. Does that make sense? I want to talk to you about an observation that I've made over the years. I think one of the mistakes we can make in fundraising is we think, well, everyone we talk to is a follower of Christ, so they kind of think the same way about giving. And I can tell you from many years of experience that there are people on all different levels of that journey of discipleship and generosity. And I want to share these different kinds of givers with you, and I'm going to ask you to, in a moment, to reflect on your own experience on these kinds of givers. I've categorized them like this. The first is the reluctant giver. I'm sad to say this is more Christians in your congregation than you might care to think. It might be as many as half. In the American church, statistics tell us that in churches of any size, whether it's 100 or 10,000, about 50% of them give $100 down to zero in the course of a year. That, to me, is a reluctant giver. Let me tell you what I think their characteristics are. Very often, they haven't grown up in families where generosity has been modeled for them. And conversely, when we see people that are innately generous, time and time again they say, I saw my mom and dad faithful, giving. They gave us allowances, but made sure part of our allowance went to the church and to Christian causes. But often people have come new to Christ or have just been in families where this hasn't been taught to them. Their common phrase, they might not say it, but the way they act their life, my money is my business. A little bit irritated to be asked, why are you talking to me about my giving? They're the kind that frequently find fault in organizations. My predecessor at Wheaton would say sometimes, some people would rather be mad than give. And we kind of all know the type. And that is a good way of pushing people aside by saying, if you were just more worthy of my giving, I would give. That's the reluctant giver. And then there's the casual giver. The casual giver has some understanding of God's call on their life, including their possessions. They've sat under the teaching of Scripture. They tend to tip God. They're the ones that put something in the offering plate, but it's usually a small, insignificant amount, far insignificant in relation to their ability to give. Their calculation is, how much of my money should I give to God? And then there's what we call the thoughtful giver. You have the thoughtful giver in your orbit, I assure you. This is someone who knows God's call on their possessions. They've experienced some joy in their giving. They've given more than nominal gifts in the past and have seen that makes a difference when they give. It not only makes a difference to the church or the organization that they support, but it makes a difference in their lives too. They see the joy in giving to the kingdom. These givers generally need to be asked. Joel mentioned we're going to do a little bit of role playing, and don't let that freak you out. We will have a good time with that, and we'll learn a ton when we do those short role playings in our second hour today. But they usually do need to be asked, and those are the kind of people that I've worked with primarily throughout my career. They really feel like if I'm not obedient to the Lord Jesus Christ in my giving, I'm not fully following Christ. We are masters at deceiving ourselves, aren't we? And some people can say, I may not be well developed as a giver, but I love the Lord Jesus and I'm sold out to Christ. My firm conviction is how we handle our money says a lot about our discipleship in the Lord Jesus Christ. The calculation of the thoughtful giver is how much of God's money should I give? Do you get the progression there? Understanding that God has provided the wealth that we have, but how much of that should I give? And then there's that very special group that we call a gifted giver. That is a very small percentage of Christian givers. But I'm willing to bet that virtually all of you, whether your circle of people that support your ministry is 50 people or 500 people or 5,000 people, you've probably got at least several gifted givers. They take great joy in giving. They seldom need to be asked. Heard the preaching of a very fine pastor on stewardship, and his challenge to his congregation is, are you collecting things or are you collecting stories? Stories of impact with your giving. And these are people that are done collecting things. They get far more joy out of collecting stories of the impact of their giving to God's people. Their calculation is, how much of God's money should I keep? Have you talked to anyone that has really struggled with that? I know some people that do. Had some people who have become good friends that were givers to ministries that I've served, who have decided that the Lord has given us all kinds of wealth. We're going to determine to live on just this much amount of assets. Everything that comes in above that, our only decision is we're going to give that away. Who do we give it away to? And even that is hard for the thoughtful giver, the gifted giver. Who should I be giving this to? Where can my gift make the most impact? And then I want to ask you this question, and I have to ask myself this question before I ask it of you. Where do you fit on that spectrum? I'm going to give you just a little word of personal testimony. I think for most of our married life, I have been more of the casual giver. When we moved to the community that we live in now, it never occurred to me not to buy the most expensive house that I could afford for the sake of my family. That I thought was providing really well for my family. Now, I'm a little wiser on this side of it. When I look back, if I would have had the maturity and the discipline to buy a less expensive house, I would have had a lot more margin for giving in most of my life. And I regret that. We have seen in the last, I would say probably more intensely in the last 5 years, but certainly in the last 10 years, I think we've kind of moved into that thoughtful giving kind of stage. We're much more intentional about giving. We gave our first gift to our church campaign within the last 2 years. The first gift that we dipped into our assets rather than just our income to make a gift. And I can just tell you the joy that has brought to us, that we are privileged to do that, has been amazing. I regret that it's happened later in our life, and that I didn't put our family in that way early in our family life. But I feel like we are growing in that particular area. Sue and I will find sermons online about giving, and we listen to those together, and we talk about how that affects what we're doing. One pastor we listened to challenged, he said, do this just for 2 months. He said, determine kind of a percentage outside of what the norm of what you're giving right now. Determine what that percentage is, and for the next 2 months, whatever income you have, give that percentage of it, and just see what God does in your life. May is month 2 of our 2-month experiment here. This might sound typical to you. We each came independently with what our percentage was in our mind. My wife's percentage was higher than mine was. So we're going with her percentage. And we're just going to see what happens there. But there was a time, first of all, that we didn't give our margin to even do that, to even think about that. And there was a time when we probably wouldn't have done that because hey, we got kids to take care of, to send through college. We've got mortgages to pay. So that's a little bit of my story, but I wanna ask you to consider your story. Wherever you are on that spectrum, are you growing? I can tell you, if you are growing, you're gonna be a much more effective fundraiser than if you're not. And a part of the joy of the work that I've done over the last 30 years is I have these conversations with givers about what gives them joy, what frustrates them, what pleases them about how their kids are using resources, what displeases them about that. Check your own life. Are you growing as a giver? I want to say one other thing about these kinds of givers. I think, and it's come out in your comments, those that are reluctant or casual in their giving, they need to hear stories from the gifted givers in your congregation. And we did this even, I didn't serve in a church, I served in Christian organizations. But we would make sure that we had some of our gifted givers tell stories to others about how God had blessed their lives, their families, not necessarily financially, but blessed them in many ways for their giving. And then we need to find out who those thoughtful and gifted givers are and give them opportunities to use their giftedness. And we're going to turn to the matter of asking. And Joel, I don't think we had this section in here, but so I'm going to say just a word about why we should ask. In my experience, a whole lot more happens when we take the time at the right time to challenge God's people to give to God's work. And I think there are some reasons for that. We are naturally selfish people. We're born selfish. Even though we are redeemed by the blood of Christ, we need to be reminded that everything we have is His. And you as pastors usually don't have any problem with calling someone to obedience to Christ, coming to Christ for salvation, renouncing sin that has crept into your life. But for some reason, when it comes to asking people to give to kingdom eternal purposes, we shrink and say, "Oof, that's not my business. I'll leave that with them." I can just tell you, in my experience, that when we take the time to think through what projects are important and related to the mission of our church or our organization, what they will cost, and if we take the time to challenge God's people, would you participate with us in making this happen?
Two quick things. In those four kinds of givers, and this was brought up already, but I just wanted to highlight it, those have nothing to do with amounts. There are selfish poor people, and there are selfish rich people, and there are generous poor people and generous rich people. So you're going to find people all over those four types of givers who have very different means, and it really doesn't matter. It's not about the amount. I just wanted to highlight that. One cool anecdote about teaching your kids to give well. One guy I knew who was a seminary professor, what he and his wife did to teach their kids about giving, they went to the bank and got $1 bills for what they made in a month. So whatever that amount was, and I have no idea what it was, but got a big stack of $1 bills, just representing everything that he and his wife made in a month. And they got the kids around the kitchen table, and they showed them the stack of money. And of course, the kids thought that was the coolest thing in the world. This is so much money. And then they said, we just want to show you how we spend our money. And so they took out the amount that they paid for their house every month, for the electric bill, for food, all these different things, and put them in piles and labeled the piles so the kids could see. And I had a pile for what they gave typically in a month. And then there was this money that was left over. And they would ask their kids, what should we do with this money? And here they give them a few options. We could buy a new TV. We could, go on a trip. We could, do whatever it was. And then they would always give them an option to give it. And invariably, the kids would give every time. They would never choose to buy something for themselves or for their families. But I just thought that was such a cool way to illustrate for kids how to use money well and how to budget, and just a lot of good principles right there. And so take that for what it's worth. But, okay. How to ask well. Like I said at the beginning, and like we heard over here, most people hate even the thought of asking for money. It's not something that comes natural to us. So it's something that we need to learn how to do, and it's something we need to practice. Just like any skill, it's something that's going to require dedication and time. We're going to make mistakes. Some people will do it real well, some people will not do it so well, but we all need to keep growing in our capacity and how we do this. So make it a part of your responsibility to learn how to do this well. We've made the case for why we think asking is important. And so now the next question is, how do we do that really well? How do we train ourselves to do that? So you need to make it part of your responsibility to be growing in this area, to be learning how to do it well, and be out there doing it. I don't know what percentage of your time in your various roles is devoted to fundraising. It might be wise for at least a period of time to devote a higher percentage to learning these skills so that you can carry them throughout your ministry. And maybe you keep that percentage higher, and if you have more success in fundraising, as we mentioned, typically money is what allows us to do a lot of the ministry that we want to do and that God has called us to. So another aspect of that is just determining how many of these individual relationships you can maintain. We have a fundraising team at my organization of about 8 full-time people, and I also spend a fair amount of time fundraising. I have a portfolio of about 40 individuals who I work with in any given year. I do more fundraising tasks outside of that, but I am responsible for those 40 individuals. That's a good number for me. I don't know what a good number for you is. You'll have to determine that. But you do need to make a determination. You can't meet with all, if you're in a congregation of even 200 people, you can't probably meet with all 200 of those people. There's just not enough time in the day. So you need to figure out how many you can develop those relationships with. You are going to, if you pursue fundraising, and even if you don't, run into people of wealth and even pretty great wealth. Depending on how we grew up, we may be less or more comfortable around people of wealth. And I think we just need to, come to terms with what it's like to be around people who have significant means and maybe very significant means. I'll just say a few things about that. Rich people want relationships like everyone else. Just because they're rich doesn't mean they don't want a relationship with you, whether you're their pastor or whether you're part of an organization they support. They want to be listened to. They want to be respected. They want to be known. Henry Nouwen wrote a little book on fundraising, just not even book. It's more like an extended article on fundraising. I forget the title of it right now, but if you just Google Henry Nouwen fundraising, it'll come up, and he talks a lot about that as well, about rich people, just like poor people or people of middling wealth. We all want relationships. A lot of us sometimes assume if somebody's really wealthy, they should just automatically give. Why isn't that rich person giving? And it's very possible that that person has not been shown, either learned from their parents how to give or been shown worthy projects. It might be that no one's really asked them. And so just being rich in and of itself is not a reason that people should give, and we can't be lazy and assume that that just because they have a lot of money, they should give to my organization or they should be giving more to my organization. So we need to be intentional about having relationships and conversations with these people about why they should give more or why they should give it all. Being a donor is not that satisfying. Being a financial partner is deeply satisfying. One of the bad tendencies of a lot of people in fundraising is to treat our donors like ATMs. We just treat them like a bank. We call them or write them an email or go visit them when we need more money for our ministry. We say thanks, and then we don't talk to them again until we need more money. That is not a Christian way to raise money. It is demeaning, it's disrespectful, and ultimately it's less effective. If we are developing warm, authentic relationships with these people, we want part of that is involving them in more than just giving. It's getting to know them as people. It's asking their opinion on your organization. Ask them what questions they have about your ministry. Ask them what concerns they have or criticisms they may have. The mature givers will do that in a very healthy way. They're going to ask good questions, and they may even have criticisms. That doesn't mean they think you're terrible or your organization is terrible or they're going to leave you. That just means they want to help you get better. Give them that opportunity. Turn them into financial partners. Make this a true partnership where they are walking alongside you as you walk alongside the people Christ has called you to. Another easy temptation is to judge people of great wealth. Look at those houses, look at those cars, look at the golf courses he plays at, look at that boat that they own, look at the lavish vacations that they go on, look at what they do for their kids. There's certainly room for discussion about how Christians should spend their money. I don't think it's our job as fundraisers to judge people for how they spend their money. I think it's important to help them grow as givers, and we can do that. That's a way we can help them use their money, but we should probably not be the ones who are putting ourselves in a position of judgment over the people we interact with about how they spend their wealth. And the last, and this should be a pretty clear biblical principle, is don't covet. I spend a lot of time around people of great wealth, and I get to go to their nice homes sometimes, and I get to play golf at their nice golf courses sometimes. And it's tempting for me to think, I deserve this. I've earned this luxury. I've earned a slice of what they have. And this lifestyle is something that I deserve for the work that I do. I don't know how else to say it other than don't covet. The Bible is pretty clear on this point, and we can't let ourselves get tempted to thinking that just because we are around people of wealth that we deserve what they have. God's given them that, and he's given us what we have. We should receive that joyfully. So, part of planning, who are we going to ask? So if you're thinking right now, here's where my ministry is at, here's our income level. If we were at this income level, our ministry could do X, Y, and Z. Here are the things that we want to do that we feel God is calling us to do as a ministry. Who are the 10 people, the 15 people, depending on the size of your organization, it might be the 100 people that you're going to ask, and why are you going to ask them? Why are you going to ask that person specifically? So we need to think through these things. So as you're planning, it might be helpful to sit down with a few others in your organization, or maybe if it's just you, just by yourself, and say, who are the 10 most likely people to give to this project or this new initiative, or even just to my ongoing budget to help us continue doing the ministry that God's called us to. One thing that we have found very effective in our fundraising work, and one thing that I would recommend to you, and this goes back to how awkward it can be to ask for money, is to ask for permission to ask. So before you ask someone for money, before you sit down in their living room or their office or wherever it might be and ask them to give whatever sum it is to your organization, ask them for permission to do that. And I can tell you what that looks like. I do this pretty frequently, and I'll either write an email or make a phone call and say, I know we've been talking about giving, and I've talked to you a little bit about this project. I was wondering if it would be okay if sometime we talked about your investment in this project, what that could look like going forward. Would that be all right if in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, we sat down together so we could talk more in depth about how you can play a part in this? Again, that could be an email, it could be a phone call, you can say it differently than that. But what that does is allows them the permission, or it gives them the opportunity to say, this isn't the right time for an ask. This isn't the right time for us, but maybe could you come back in 6 months? Could we have that conversation? Or if they say, yes, I'd love to hear more about that, and I'd love to hear how I could get involved. That diffuses a lot of the pressure. That takes a lot of pressure off of you. Now that you've got their permission, then the only thing to do is, again, back to planning, figuring out some of the specifics of how you want to do this and sitting down and having that conversation. So asking permission to ask is one of the best things you can do for them and for yourself. I think it shows a lot of respect and a lot of foresight on your part when you give them the authority to say, is now the right time to talk to me about this, or here's the right time, here's the right way. Asking for permission. Any other comments on that, or did I hit it?
No, you nailed it.
All right, good. Okay, another part of planning. When are we going to ask? I just mentioned that a little bit. That's going to be oftentimes determined by what our project is. If we need the money by such and such a date, then we have to have our asks done well ahead of time because we need to give people time to actually make those gifts. So there's a when part from the organizational perspective, by when do we need this money? And if you don't know that for your project, you need to know that. And donors will respond well when you can give them clarity. The other side of the when issue is from the donor's perspective. Most of our organizations, and certainly in my organization, I always wanted the money yesterday. But we do better by our donors and will be more effective when we realize that we want to ask when they're ready, not when the organization needs the money. So we want to wait for them to be ready, and that's another part of asking permission. And that's why I think that's a really wise thing to do. How much are we going to ask for? We might know the total amount of the project we're working on or the total amount we need to hit our budget this year. But when we're going to ask someone specifically for money, we need to know how much we're going to ask that person for and why we're asking for that much. Looking at their past giving history, if you have access to that, is a really helpful guide. You can look at other indicators of how much you might ask for. But what this requires usually is having a relationship with that person. So it goes back to developing those authentic relationships. Our people are not just ATMs, they're not banks. And so we need to, as we determine how much, we need to be very thoughtful in our planning. And anticipating objections. Thinking about, okay, if I'm going to go ask Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so for 10,000 euros towards this building project that we're doing towards a building renovation, why might they not want to do that? Is it not the right time? Is this not the right project? Am I asking for too much? Do they not understand the project or the impact it'll have on the ministry? Thinking through specifically why these people, what objections or criticisms they might have. If you plan ahead and think through that, it'll make your ask much more effective. The last thing you want to do is have them ask a question that you were not prepared to answer at all. So anticipate what those objections might be.